Welcome to the 13th video in this series, The Character of the Communist Mode Production According to Marx and Engels. Today, we'll be going over the 1875 piece by Marx, The Critique of the Gotha Programme. This is one of my favorite pieces in this series, and I really do hope that you will stick around and listen in. I've subtitled this From Each According to Ability to Each According to Need. In this text, Marx presents a correction on Lassalle's proposed program, correcting the phrases while giving an explanation about the stages of economic maturity of communism, wherein quantitative developments in a variety of factors within a classless and thereby stateless and moneyless society that develops out of the internal class struggle engendered by capitalism leads to the positive transcendence beyond bourgeois right, that is to say, the higher phase of communism. So, to preface, earlier, a YouTuber named Proletariat produced a video talking about this topic, and I, in fact, disagree with their interpretation that there is no higher and lower phase. There is clearly a quantitative development resulting in a qualitative development within the lower phase of communism as is developing, and the higher phase, which allows for the development of the Gemeinschaft. These are distinct characteristics, and Marx is actually explicit about this to some degree, with the understanding of the distinction between the Gemeinwesen, which we'll talk about later most pertinently with Engels, and the Gemeinschaft, which is community as association. The dictatorship of the proletariat, as we will talk about in some degree in the Dictatorship of the Proletariat series, most notably the PowerPoint series that I will eventually create for it, is going to be talking about this transition between it and the lower phase of communism, wherein there's a Gemeinwesen. This Gemeinwesen eventually emerges into the Gemeinschaft. So clearly, Marx had in mind some sort of quantitative development of various things that we'll talk about in this piece unto qualitative development. That is not to say that these are distinct modes of production. It's in the exact same way as capitalism reaches a higher phase or stage, imperialism, through a coalition and coagulation of the varying forces within it, leading into financialization and then monopoly capital as the various national markets within each nation get filled up, and then the capitalists must expand internationally and open up markets in foreign nations in competition with foreign bourgeois who want to maintain control over their own national markets and therefore enter into imperialist warfare and imperialism itself. Continuing. To begin with, Marx specifies that nature is a source of use values and is what fundamentally makes up all material wealth, although it must be rendered through human labor to be useful for humans. Therefore, those who claim dominion over the instruments and subjects of labor, such as nature and other such means of production, also claim dominion over the wealth made from that human labor upon them. In such a condition, wherein private ownership is in place, nature becomes mystified, with labor appearing as the source of use values, and thereby wealth in this inversion of social production of wealth. Through the creation of this mystification, and making labor seem to be above the instruments that labor is applied to, it makes it so those who possess no property other than their own labor become the slave of those who own the material conditions of labor, as they cannot engage in labor without their permission, and thus cannot live without their permission. It is only the labor that the owner demands which is socially recognized. It is only in social practice that labor can produce wealth and culture in and through society. Though labor can produce for the individual and their needs in theory, certainly not what is socially necessary at this stage of historic development. I can't make a phone in my household. I can't make a phone in the middle of nowhere outside of society. I can't make the things that are necessary for modern living within this mode of production. Next, Marx rejects individualistic accounts of communism, wherein the, quote, undiminished proceeds of labor, end quote, are granted to each individual worker. He specifies that the conception of proceeds of labor will eventually disappear as the economic maturity of communism develops. All societies must reproduce themselves materially to maintain their existence no matter what, being economic necessities that are determined not by equity, but rather by available means and forces of production to a given society, and statistics allowing them to compute probabilities. The greater the understanding and development of these, the more precisely a given society can determine its costs to maintain itself. In all societies, the cooperative proceeds of labor, or the total social product, must be deducted by costs to 1. Replacement of means of production used up. Statistics applied to these would be in the form of depreciation, if we're talking in accounting terms. 2. Expansion of production, which is determined by a variety of potential and definite factors. For example, a society might decide to employ greater focus on development of productive forces and producers in some processes. The greater the concentration of means of production, the more costs are used to replace them too. And how a society determines what means of production to expand is definitely determined, but also socially determined. For example, in capitalism, this is determined by the market and investment of money capital. In communist society, this is determined directly and socially. And 3. Reserve or insurance funds for accidents, crises, and so on. Then, after that, from the so-called proceeds of labor, further is deducted by all societies, but particularly in communist society. 1. General costs of administration, which will be handled socially through the new Gemeinwesen, the general intellect of scientific society, which administers things and directs processes of production. The costs of this will reduce as communism economically matures. 2. Common satisfaction of needs, which will increase in amount as communism economically emerges and more is brought into the social sphere. For example, such a communal society will recognize the benefits of mass social projects, providing all necessities and access to all necessary support to develop the individual to their maximum ability. And 3. Funds for those unable to work for whatever reason. Eventually, costs to expand production, replace current means of production, and the development of common satisfaction of needs will use up all available quote-unquote proceeds of labor. But this thrusts all of humanity into a realm of absolute social wealth. Quote, what the producer is deprived of in his capacity as a private individual comes back to him as a member of society, end quote. All have access to the whole of humanity's collective wealth. Products of society that the individual consumes for themselves, for example, food, products that are used up in daily life, and so on, are part of the, quote, to each according to their need, end quote, which ever increases as the wealth of society increases. Anything outside of such means of consumption are socially available, with all wealth being made social over time, with any right of exclusion brought to an end, thus making all products of society commonly held and therefore accessible. So there's no purpose or use for any sort of hoarding either, to be clear. Next, Marx explains the distinction between the lower phase of communism, wherein classes and money have been abolished, but its economic maturity keeps it unable to fully transcend bourgeois right. In communist society, a cooperative one based on common ownership of the means of production, the associated producers do not exchange their products, and individual labor is no longer an indirect contribution, with labor time being made abstract and under the ownership of an individual who owns the means by which that labor is carried out. Rather, is a direct component of the total labor of society. In the lower phase, as communist society is developing, it has the birthmarks of capitalist society in all aspects. As a result, the individual producers at this stage must receive individual recognition of their individual quantum of labor of that total social labor in the form of some receipt, certificate, voucher, ledger, or any other form of method of tracking individual contribution which evidences that they have worked a number of hours of labor after aforementioned deductions. Using the certificate, the laborer is able to draw from social stock means of consumption that is the same in labor time. Quote, the same amount of labor which he has given in one form, he receives back in another. One time unit, for example, an hour of socially necessary labor time, abstracted, homogenized human labor, though negatively recognized as a direct component, is equal to itself, in-kind calculations. Thus, there is still some degree of alienation through the abstraction of labor and exchange of equal values, but is in a new form and content, and is being steadily removed due to their transitory nature. In such a system, individual labor is no longer an indirect contribution to total social labor, mediated by commodity exchange by the labor market, but is instead a direct component of it, with its social character being recognized from the onset rather than post hoc through the market. In addition, no one can give anything except their own personal labor rather than sell capital, land, or labor power, and only individual means of consumption can be drawn from social stock. No one can gain private control over the conditions of production. And this is my own writing here, as a concrete example of what would potentially look like from the perspective of someone in a communist society in the lower phase. There's a warehouse, either a single one for an area, or a number of them with specialty products, wherein there are means of subsistence of all kinds available. You either pick them up, or potentially have them delivered. This place has no shop owners, and no one is selling the products. Instead, you simply take what you need off the shelves or ask for what you need from the quote-unquote accountant. Some of it will be quote-unquote free. Society will have been able to be so productive with it, for example basic foodstuffs, that there's no point in individually comparing labor with it. Or perhaps it is a common good, which will be produced regardless if people will consume it or not, or would society make the decision to include in automatic accounting like healthcare, or like a train, or something along those lines. So it's simply included in the aforementioned common deductions. After receiving your personal means of subsistence, you present your labor card, which has recorded the quantity of social labor you have done as an individual as a ledger. They cancel out that period, with 1 hour of socially necessary labor time being equal to 1 hour of socially necessary labor time in products. The people doing the labor at the warehouse, directing consumers around, inputting information, and so on, do not receive any vouchers from the consumers. The vouchers do not exchange or persist across the quote-unquote exchange. They are destroyed. Instead, they receive their own for the labor time they have done. The purposes of this exchange is not to accrue wealth, but instead to aid in economic planning and deal with remnant social and economic necessities. The warehouse's stock is replenished according to rational, planned economic determinations carried out by the free and equal associated producers, with necessities and common goods initially automatically accounted for and requiring nothing but accounting activity for planning purposes, with the tallied up consumption intended to reach balance accounts while reporting to the Planning Bureau, so that planning is refined by us knowing what is popular, how much is being consumed, what is unpopular, and so on, with small caveats for different conditions such as need for privacy, transportation of products, specialty and unique production, and so on. And an example of this, right, might be doing something along the lines of pre-ordering for a specialty or unique production item of some sort, right? You do a pre-order, which gives time for it to be produced. In general, people don't need some super weird thing immediately off the shelf. So there should be a culture of doing that sort of thing, but by and large, everything that you need in your day-to-day life at all times will be available, and what is not available is quickly available. If you need privacy, then it might be some form of upcharge, and with the intent of essentially saying, hey, look, society needs to be able to plan, right? But if we don't know what it's exactly that's being asked for, then there's an extra cost to society involved with that. So if you say, I want something that is made out of silicone, and I don't want to say what is actually aimed at producing for whatever reason, who knows, then, we might put put on an extra cost associated with that, but very small in character. It's for planning purposes, nothing more. Where there's overproduction due to shifting demand, you might see some small decrease in quote-unquote price due to depreciation and the like, and vice versa with underproduction, when statistical anticipation of demand is not in tune with production, with the true labor time being printed on them. This lower phase with labor certification is fundamentally within bourgeois limitations, with the right of producers being proportional to the labor they supply, thus barring people from access to the whole of society's wealth. Instead, they have their individual wealth as individual producers. The equality within the society is in that measurement is made with the equal standard that is labor time within that society, which comes with further caveats. 1. All those outside of that given society in terms of economic maturity are thereby unequal in relation and are deficit in comparison. And 2. Because labor acts as a measure, it must be defined by duration and intensity. Therefore, for equality to be the case, inequality must be negatively transcended through force of will. Labor must be treated unequally, with unequal individuals granted more or less, and given individual remuneration more or less, according to their ability. Right in this society is unequal, and the only way to have reduced this is effectively affirmative action nationally and internationally, to make labor equal. Such is only possible as society develops and makes it possible though. This is where something like the joint dictatorship of the proletariat is needed, wherein all the different nations that are part of the dictatorship of the proletariat and then later within the World Republic combine their economic might as one. And different regions that are less developed, they of course require additional help. And regions that are highly developed require less help. So there's an equalization process, and some nations will undergo stricter conditions. Let's just put it like that. But there will be no costs to any individuals, to be clear. It is on a societal basis that we're looking at this. Continuing. Eventually, this is, and also this supports people who are unable to work for any given reason, be it age or disability or physical accident or anything along those lines, right? So eventually, this is positively transcended as the economic structure of society develops, with the tempered cultural development expanding. This is the point at which bourgeois right is escaped. That is to say, that the higher phase of communism is achieved and the condition of, quote, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs is realized. This state is realized as 1. The division of labor is ended. 2. Labor becomes life's prime want as all alienation ceases. And 3. The productive forces and all individuals have reached high development for cooperative wealth being made fully accessible. At this point, no right of inequality is necessary or recognition of individual labor. All that is left is calculation of probabilities, administration of production, and a resultant organization of distribution which, in this case, is determined by the material conditions of production being the cooperative property of the freely associated producers, thus resulting in an entirely new form of distribution. Labor certification becomes needed only for purposes of planning and on a social basis, not individual. More and more means of subsistence get produced to the point where it becomes a fetter on society to demand individual payment for it. For example, we got more potatoes than we know what to do with, just take them, it's already accounted for, as an example. This expands more and more social production is brought together. Individual claims become a fetter on production and consumption as a right of exclusion. The desire for greater wealth and leisure within communism leads people to abolishing remaining bourgeois conceptions of property. In addition, society is geared towards common goods, for example, trains and buses, over private vehicles. Ultimately, the Commonwealth, or the Genossenschaftliche Reichtum, emerges in full. This is not unlimited access to abundant goods, but rather a reversal of primitive accumulation's artificial scarcity, with radical abundance in the form of the Commonwealth, which makes social wealth equally accessible to everyone at the cost of private wealth, is the commonification of wealth, rehabilitating it into abundance. And that is my summary of Marx's critique of the Gotha Programme. If you'd like to go over the quotations I derived this summary from, then please feel free to go to the description below and access the shared Google Doc containing this. Though I will say that I added in significant amounts from some of the other economic works that I have engaged that have also engaged this text. For example, the Gix piece and Towards the New Socialism. Anyway, also, as always, I would recommend giving the United Marxist Pact a look. And tomorrow we will be going over my summary of Engels' anti-Dühring, Herr Eugene Dühring's Revolution in Science. And we will be doing specifically part 3, Socialism. Thank you for joining me for today's topical summary, and I hope to see you tomorrow.